But the Wilderness Act specifically prohibits the use of certain activities and equipment. There's no use of motor vehicles, motorized equipment or motorboats, no landing of aircraft, and no other form of mechanical transportation.
But it prohibits more than tools, doesn't it?
Oh yes, it prohibits any commercial enterprise, permanent or temporary road, any structure, any installation.
And are those prohibitions absolute?
No, they're not absolute, except for permanent roads. Prohibition on commercial enterprises is limited to those that may be performed to the extent necessary for activities that are proper for realizing the recreational or other wilderness values. And the other prohibited tools and developments are limited to except as necessary to meet the minimum requirements for the administration of the area for the purposes of wilderness. These limitations or other provisions apply to the administrative uses of the wilderness and not to the public use. Those restrictions for the public are absolute.
Well, what about someone who needs a wheelchair? That's mechanical transport, isn't it?
It is mechanical transport, and that's a good point, Chris. The ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, does say that folks who have disabilities and wheelchairs should be allowed the use of wilderness, but we don't have to modify the wilderness to allow that use.
Okay. Well, let's get back to Section 4C. Except as necessary to meet minimum requirements is more than just picking the minimum tool.
Yes, it's giving consideration to whether the action that you're contemplating is even necessary at all in the wilderness. For example, before you decide to use hand tools to build a bridge in the wilderness, is the bridge absolutely necessary? And before you decide to put in trail directional signs in the wilderness, is that necessary? And then a good example here in the Everglades is we get constant requests for research to be done in the wilderness. Is it necessary? Can it be done someplace else? And those questions all have to be answered. And then if the answer is yes, then you decide what's the minimum tool to get the job done.
So first you decide if any action is necessary, and then you decide what the least impacting way of doing that would be.
And this doesn't just apply to future actions. I think it also requires us to go back and look at what we currently have in wilderness areas. It may mean removing some things that aren't absolutely necessary and appropriate to the wilderness experience.
Our second cornerstone talks about preserving wildness and natural conditions. And our first cornerstone is to manage wilderness as a whole. Maureen, do you have an example from here at the Everglades where using the minimum necessary is brought into play with these cornerstones?
Well, I think a very good example is the one of the Cape Sable seaside sparrow.
Excellent. That brings in another law, too, doesn't it?
It brings in the Endangered Species Act.
So what kind of alternatives were you looking at in terms of enhancing the sparrow population?
We evaluated a number of alternatives that were put on the table. Some required quite a bit of manipulation. For example, the introduction of certain kind of grasses into the area that the sparrows inhabit, or looking at what kind of predators that might need to be removed in order to protect the sparrow, looking at the building of dams in order to channel the water in a certain direction to improve the overall habitat. And those were rejected for two reasons. One, I think they were looked at as almost single species management, and what impact would they have on other species, and also the fact that this is wilderness, and that kind of habitat modification is not appropriate. And returning to a more natural sheet flow of water is much less intrusive, preserves wilderness values, preserves wildness, and also helps the management of a number of species while not hopefully detrimental to the endangered species.
So you found that by using the minimum necessary, you not only manage wilderness as a whole, you weren't managing just for the sparrow, and you've not only preserved wildness by keeping out these additional trammeling influences, but you've also preserved natural conditions by restoring the water flow.
Mm-hmm. That's correct. And so that was really the best alternative for us.